In the quiet town of Elmridge, nestled between rolling hills and whispering pine trees, lived a young woman named Elara Moreau. Her presence was a gentle contrast to the cold and calculating world around her. She was known for her kindness, her soft-spoken nature, and the way she carried sorrow in her eyes, like a permanent shadow. Elara had once been a girl of dreams, of poetry and piano music, of laughter that echoed like wind chimes in spring. But those days had burned away like dry leaves in a fire 5 years ago, the day her world fell apart, the day her family's legacy was stolen and her father died with betrayal clinging to his last breath. At the heart of it all was Julian Graves, her father's closest friend and business partner, a man the town respected, revered even, for building an empire of glass and gold. But only Elara knew what that empire was built on: lies, deceit, and blood. Her father, Henry Moreau, had been the visionary behind Moreau Enterprises, a tech company that promised to bring change and compassion to an industry run by greed. But compassion was not a coin the world traded in. Julian had seen the potential, seen the billions, and he wanted it all. One forged document, one false accusation, one sudden accident on the mountain road. That was all it took for Elara to go from heiress to orphan, from comfort to despair. The media told a story of business failure and tragedy, but Elara had watched the tapes, had seen Julian walk into her house the night her father died, wearing a smile too calm for a grieving friend, and when she confronted him, he offered a single line that etched itself into her soul. "You're too young to understand how the world works. Be grateful I left you with anything at all," left with nothing but her mother's piano and the clothes. On her back, Elara disappeared from Elmridge. They thought she was broken. She let them believe it. For 5 years, she vanished from every circle, erased her name, and became a ghost. But ghosts don't rest, they haunt. In the underbelly of distant cities, Elara learned to fight, to read contracts with a predator's eye, to understand the world Julian lived in, the language of power, the currency of secrets. She worked under aliases in law firms, investment firms, even Julian's own satellite company, under a false identity, collecting every thread she would need to pull him apart. She became someone else, someone colder, smarter, patient, and now she was back, not as the broken girl he thought he buried, but as the storm he never saw coming. Elara returned to Elmridge on the first autumn wind, when the leaves had begun their graceful fall, reminding her that even endings could be beautiful. She arrived not as Elara Moreau, the orphan girl swallowed by grief, but as Elena Marlowe, a poised investor with a quiet reputation and a resume built on fabrications, so flawless they could withstand the scrutiny of 1,000 background checks. Her entrance into Julian Graves's world was as elegant as it was precise. Graves Industries, now a monolith in the global tech landscape, had recently announced a bid for a new artificial intelligence division. It was the perfect opportunity, and Elara had already aligned herself with one of the companies competing for the merger. She wasn't here to win a deal. She was here to win his trust, so she could tear it from the inside out. Their reunion was staged at a gala event in downtown Elmridge, beneath chandeliers that shimmered like false promises. Elara wore black, silk and diamond studs that caught the light like daggers. Julian, older now but still arrogant, still blind, shook her hand with practiced charm. "Eleanor Marlowe," he repeated, tasting her alias like fine wine. "I've heard of your work. Brilliant, efficient, and mysterious." She smiled, slow and unreadable, and replied, "Mystery is the luxury of those who've had everything taken from them." He laughed, unaware of the double edge in her words. and welcomed her into his circle, like a lamb, never realizing it was a lion he had invited into his den. Over the weeks that followed, Alara infiltrated every layer of Julian's world. She charmed his board members, manipulated his investors, and whispered the right suggestions into the right ears. She uncovered the bones in his closet, fraudulent patents, embezzled funds, destroyed lives, all buried beneath a gleaming corporate mask. But she didn't expose him immediately. No, Alara was a master gardener now, tending to her plan like roses in winter. She wanted him to believe in her, trust her, depend on her, and he did. Julian began inviting her to private dinners, exclusive meetings, and finally to his own estate, the same place where her father had once discussed building dreams. She walked those halls like a shadow reborn, noting the portraits, the renovations, the grotesque comfort he had carved out of Betrayal, and in every room she planted a seed. But revenge, Alara had learned, was not just about destruction, it was about revelation. She wanted Julian to see her, truly see her, in the moment his world crumbled. So she laid the final piece of her trap, a forged investment offer that would expose Julian's hidden offshore accounts, blackmail history, and illegal surveillance systems. She delivered it with a flourish and a note. One must always pay their debts. He signed the deal with pride, believing he had secured another victory. But what he had signed was the beginning of his fall. The first crack came with a leaked document, an anonymous file sent to every major news outlet and government authority. Within it were records of Julian's financial manipulations, along with detailed testimonies from former employees, all orchestrated and gathered by Alara. As panic set into Graves Industries, Alara stood beside him in the boardroom, feigning concern. His eyes were wide, his hands shaking. "This can't be real," he muttered. "This has to be a setup." Alara leaned in, her voice velvet and steel. "It's very real. And I told you once, be grateful I left you with anything, at all." In that instant, recognition flashed across Julian's face, not just of the betrayal, but of the ghost he thought he'd buried. Alara. Her name trembled on his lips like a curse, but she didn't let him speak it. Instead, she walked out of the boardroom, leaving the press and law enforcement at his doorstep, and the weight of his sins collapsing over him like a cathedral of rot. Julian Graves had ruled his empire with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. But now, that confidence unraveled with every headline, every frozen account, every subpoena delivered to his marble estate. The media circled like vultures, feeding on the scandal of a tech titan's fall from grace. His board of directors turned on him swiftly, abandoning him like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Government agents seized his files, his servers, even his personal journals. His reputation, once untarnished, was now a canvas painted with disgrace. But through it all, the thing that haunted him most was not the crumbling company or the legal firestorm. It was the memory of that voice, calm and deliberate, whispering his own words back to him. "Be grateful I left you with anything at all." That voice belonged to Alara Moreau, the girl he had underestimated, the heir he had tried to erase. And now she had returned, not as a whisper, but as an inferno. Alara watched from a distance, not with joy or cruelty, but with cold precision. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about justice. And she wasn't finished. Julian's empire might have collapsed publicly, but Alara wanted his soul stripped bare. She wanted him to feel what she had felt 5 years ago. Powerless, cornered, betrayed. So she began the second act of her revenge. targeting the only thing Julian still had: control. Beneath the chaos, he had one last bastion: his private equity firm, hidden in the shadows, untouched by the corporate disaster. It held his secret fortune, his real influence, and his final chance at survival. But Alara had already found it. Using the connections she had built during her disappearance, she launched a quiet campaign, pressuring investors, leaking whispers of instability, and pulling strings through silent allies. One by one, his partners withdrew, his funds evaporated, and his name became poison in financial circles. Julian, desperate and paranoid, withdrew into isolation. He moved into his country estate, far from the flashing cameras and courtrooms, trying to salvage what little he could. He spent his nights poring over old files, trying to find out how she had done it. How a girl he had once dismissed as a fragile child had brought down a kingdom. He called in private investigators, traced aliases, and finally, in a moment of clarity, pieced it all together. Elena Marlowe, the investor, the assistant, the leak, the liar, the lion, all the same woman, Alara. The realization crushed him. Meanwhile, Alara returned to her childhood home, abandoned for years, left to rot like an open wound. The house stood on the edge of town, surrounded by wild overgrowth and silence. She walked through each room slowly, running her fingers over the walls that once held laughter and warmth. Her father's study was still intact, dust-covered and frozen in time. On the desk, a photograph of them together smiled back at her. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and whispered, "I did it, Dad. He doesn't get to win." The moment was quiet, heavy with memory, but even as tears welled in her eyes, Alara knew her journey was not about reclaiming the past. It was about ensuring no one else suffered the way she had, with Julian's power shattered and his reputation in tatters. Alara made one final move. She arranged a meeting, not in secret, but publicly, in a quiet cafe in downtown Elmridge. She sent the invitation under her real name this time. Julian came, gaunt and grey, the weight of disgrace etched into every line on his face. He sat across from her, hollow-eyed, staring at the woman he had once thought of as collateral damage. "You," he breathed. The word a mix of hatred and disbelief. Alara met his gaze without flinching. "Me," she replied. "The girl you buried alive." Julian scoffed bitterly. "So what now? You want to see me grovel? Apologize. That's not how this world works." Alara leaned forward, her voice like winter wind. "I don't want your apology. I want your legacy to die with you." Julian stared at Alara in stunned silence, trying to summon the arrogance that had once shielded him. But it was gone, eroded by scandal, disgrace, and the undeniable truth that sat across from him. He was looking into the eyes of his reckoning. "You think this makes you better than me?" he spat finally, grasping for a final thread of control. "You destroyed me, my company, my name. You've become the very thing you hated." Alara's lips curled into a smile that carried no joy. "No," she said softly. "I became what was necessary." She rose from the table, leaving a small envelope in front of him. His final gift. Inside are documents transferring what's left of your holdings to a charitable foundation in my father's name. You won't see a penny. You'll die in obscurity, remembered not as a visionary, but as a fraud. Julian didn't open the envelope. He didn't have to. He knew she had won, completely and irreversibly, and she hadn't needed to raise her voice or pull a trigger. She had simply turned his own weapons against him. As Alara walked away from the cafe and out into the cool, golden sunlight of Elmridge, something inside her shifted. For 5 years she had lived with the fire of vengeance in her veins, each breath a promise to the man who stole her future. Now that fire was spent, and in its place was something quieter, a fragile peace. She had not reclaimed what was lost. Her father was still gone, her childhood still stained by betrayal. But she had rewritten the ending. Julian's empire lay in ruins. His lies were unmasked, his influence reduced to whispers. The man who once stood at the peak of power now lived in the shadows of his disgrace. Weeks passed. Julian's name vanished from headlines, overtaken by newer scandals and fleeting public attention. He sold off properties at bargain prices, attempted to sue everyone from his board to the government, but no court would listen. His words no longer held weight. He became a relic, pitied by some, ignored by most, and eventually forgotten. Alara, meanwhile, began to build something new, not a company, not a brand, something simpler. She turned her childhood home into a community center, the Moreau Foundation, a space for underprivileged youth to learn, to grow, to create futures unburdened by the cruelty of the world. She taught them music, strategy, discipline, and justice, not the kind that comes from anger, but the kind that rises from resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in hues of flame and rose, Alara stood at the edge of her property, overlooking the town that had once turned its back on her. The wind carried with it the distant laughter of children playing inside, the soft notes of a piano drifting through the air. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale, not in pain, not in pursuit, but in peace. She thought of her father, of the dreams they once shared, and whispered into the wind, "We made it." Far away, in a small cottage far from Elmridge's center, Julian Graves sat alone, staring at the flickering television screen, his fingers wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched in hours. The world had moved on without him. No one called, no one visited. There were no interviews, no articles begging for his insight, no invitations to speak. The silence was suffocating. On the wall, dusty awards and plaques hung like tombstones, and in his drawer, untouched since that day in the cafe, was the envelope Alara had left him. He had never opened it. He didn't need to. It wasn't just a legal blow. It was a message, a final signature that said, "I outgrew you." And so, the story ended not with thunder, but with silence. Alara Moreau had taken nothing more than what was stolen from her, and in return, she gave the world a lesson it wouldn't soon forget, that even in ashes, roses can bloom, and that sometimes the most beautiful revenge is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be. Months turned into a year, and Alara's life unfolded like a sunrise after a long storm. She no longer walked with the burden of revenge clinging to her soul. Instead, she moved with a quiet confidence, a purpose rooted not in pain, but in healing. The Moreau Foundation thrived. Children from broken homes and difficult pasts found in her what she once longed for, someone who believed in them. She watched them learn, laugh, fall, and rise again. And in every small triumph they achieved, she saw her father's legacy living on. Alara never spoke publicly about Julian or what she had done. She didn't need to. The people who mattered saw the truth in her actions, in the way she chose to rebuild rather than destroy, to create instead of consume. But the past has a way of returning, not always with vengeance, sometimes only with echoes. One rainy afternoon, as Alara was locking up the center, she saw a figure standing just beyond the garden gates. He was older, thinner, and drenched by the rain, but unmistakable. Julian Graves. She didn't speak, didn't run, didn't falter. She simply stood and waited as he approached. his steps heavy, his eyes hollow with years of disgrace. "I won't stay long," he said, voice rough like gravel. "I just wanted to see if you were real, if everything they said was true." Alara raised an eyebrow. "And is it?" He looked around. The children's artwork, the library, the music room, where soft melodies spilled into the air. "It is," he whispered. "It's all real. You turned my ashes into a cathedral." There was a long pause, filled only by the tapping rain on the rooftop. He glanced at her then, not with pride or power, but the gaze of a man finally broken. "I came to say I'm sorry, not because I expect forgiveness. I know better than that. I just needed to say it once, with whatever dignity I have left." Alara studied him, her expression unreadable. "You had everything," she said, her voice low, "and you threw it away for more. You thought killing my father would kill his dream too. But all you did was plant it in me." Julian nodded slowly, like a man hearing the verdict he always knew was coming. "I know." He turned to leave, but Alara stopped him with a final word. "Live, Julian. That's your punishment. Live with it. No prisons. No deathbed escape. Just time. Enough to see what you lost and what I built from your ruins." He looked back once, the rain blurring his vision, then walked into the grey distance, swallowed by the mist. In the years that followed, Alara became something of a myth in Elmridge. To some, she was the woman who defeated a titan. To others, she was the girl who returned from the grave to change the world. But to those who truly knew her, those who found hope in her eyes and strength in her scars, she was simply Alara, the one who never gave up, the one who turned her pain into power. She never remarried, never chased wealth or fame. She chose instead to live quietly, surrounded by the sound of piano keys and children's laughter, a soft, endless reminder that healing could be louder. Then revenge. On the 5th anniversary of the foundation, a mural was unveiled on the side of the building, an enormous painting of a single red rose growing from a crack in black stone. Beneath it, in gold letters, were the words, "We rise from, say, ashes. We bloom in spite." Alara stood beneath it with tears in her eyes and pride in her heart. Somewhere in the wind, she thought she heard her father's voice again. Not in sorrow, but in peace. He would have been proud, not because she destroyed Julian, but because she did it without becoming him. In the end, Alara Moreau didn't just win. She transcended. She became the rose that bloomed in ashes. Proof that even the deepest betrayal could be the beginning of something beautiful. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light on everything she had rebuilt, Alara smiled, genuine and full, for the first time in years, because this was her story now, not one of revenge, but of reclamation. And in her silence, in her strength, the world finally learned the most beautiful revenge is rising so high, they can never reach you again.